Welcome back to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. This week is a little different. We're actually going to discuss John's upcoming trip to the Falkland Islands. John is going to the Falklands to study penguins this month, so we had a bunch of questions and wanted to hear all about his upcoming trip. There's a lot to cover. We actually talk a lot about bird flu and how this could potentially impact somewhere like the Falklands. We hear about a trip that John has taken previously there and what he's expecting for this go-around. If you aren't familiar, the Falkland Islands are in the middle of the ocean, kind of near the southern tip of South America and also Antarctica. John gives us a much better explanation, but it's a super exciting place to study. Okay, go grab your binoculars, your passport, and let's get into it. All right, well, you guys ready to talk about... John, so you want to talk about your trip?
Sure, I'm ready to talk about the trip.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so John, you've got a big trip coming up, right?
I do. Thanks to the Pritzker Center for Meteoritics and Polar Studies, we have a grant to go with some colleagues that are penguin specialists to the Falkland Islands, and leaving on the 28th of November and coming back on the 21st of December. And we're basically going back to a place that we stopped 2 years ago and had a little bit of time to walk around and see when we took a sailboat to Antarctica. But this will give us access to a whole different set of penguin populations that we haven't sampled previously.
So for people that aren't familiar with the Falkland Islands, do you want to tell us kind of like where it is and how you get there exactly? Because it's pretty out there, right?
For sure. And I will say one of the best things about our jobs is we have opportunities to go to places that we might never have dreamed we'd ever go. And the Falkland Islands is certainly one of these places. It's a set of islands about 300 miles off the coast of South America, to the east of South America. And it sits out in this current of water that goes clockwise around Antarctica. And it's north of what's called the polar front, which is the area where the really cold water from Antarctica is flowing in an easterly direction. And South Georgia, for instance, which is another island that's about 300 kilometers away, is south of the polar front and has mountains with glaciers. Well, the Falklands is geologically connected to South America. There are two main islands and something like 760 small islands in this little archipelago. It's about the size of Connecticut. And it's, again, as I said, it's north of the polar front. So what it's got is basically, it's covered in tussock grass. That's the primary vegetation. There are no trees. And so I think, describe it as austere is pretty accurate. It's a British overseas territory is what it's defined as. There are only about 4,000 people there.
Oh, wow.
And most of what they do is farm sheep.
Okay. And then there's a lot of penguins there.
There are definitely a lot of penguins. It's a really big concern this year. We're getting a number of notices about the presence of bird flu, which is something that's, and it's gonna curtail what we can do because we want to be, we're following the guidelines of the Ministry of Environment, who's giving us the permits to handle penguins. But hundreds of birds are dying at various colonies right now as the result of bird flu having got there. And, it's worth talking about because bird flu is something that can travel as the result of human activities for sure. It's been showing up at chicken farms in the U.S., but the idea that it can get to a place like the Falkland Islands, which is absolutely remote, illustrates that it can be carried by wild birds and moved around across the landscape really effectively. And I think the big challenge for penguins is that they nest in these colonies where they're pretty densely packed, and it's an ideal situation to transmit disease from bird to bird. And so once it gets there, it can cause a lot of problems.
So it's aerosolized, kind of like COVID is, right? So you breathe it, you can breathe it in. Personally, well, I'm kind of obsessed with viruses and public health responses to viruses, given people close to me died of COVID and anyways. But if you look at the government uh, of the Falklands, they have a very delicate balance of protecting people and wildlife, right? Because not only do they have to protect where people go because of infecting penguins, also penguins could infect humans. And this is, this is just, we're at that balancing stage of how you move forward, what state of an emergency system is that this is in. And I don't want to be right, but I am really worried about public health responses across the globe to bird flu, because if we think COVID was bad, bird flu spreading like this in humans could be way worse than COVID even was. So I am super duper worried about this, as my family can attest to my obsession with public health and telling them what they should and shouldn't do. But I do think of how really difficult it is for public health officials to deal with this. There was an interesting paper that was published in September 3rd of 2024 about the arrival of bird flu in the Falklands.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would say in addition to that is that we're going to be taking precautions to, one, not spread it from place to place. So we'll be cleaning gear and using what's called PPE in the language of the scientific community, where it's basically disposable coverings to protect you and the birds you're working with from spreading any disease around. And we won't go to places that the government feels like aren't safe to go at the time we get there. At the same time, I point out how critical it is to get data. And so there's some other research groups now that have been sampling for the past 2 seasons across the Falklands, and we're in communication with them, and we're going to be sampling largely in areas that they haven't gone to, and that'll fill in a bigger picture of sort of what's going on across the Falklands in a way that I hope will be useful for preserving the penguins over time.
I mean, there have already been, to turn it into a science thing and less about the doom and gloom horror that I turn it into in my brain. But it was first discovered in 2023 there in a brown skua on Bird Island. And so that bird tested positive. But the interesting thing, just like it was with COVID for me too, is that there's enough DNA sequencing that has been done on bird flu now that you could see what the tree of life for bird flu looked like. And what the tree of life tells you is where those viruses came from in the world. So, and it was pretty clear, and the tree of life tells you pretty clearly that there have been, up to that point, there were two different strains that had gotten into Antarctica. Both of them trace themselves back to Argentina, or back to Patagonia, I suppose. And so that's a really important piece of knowledge to know where the strains are coming from. And the tree of life, the things that we do are really important in the study of diseases.
So I'll take that to another level with respect to the birds and the kind of sampling we're doing. So this is going to be used in a postdoctoral research by a graduate, a woman who got her PhD last year at the University of Stony Brook, Rachel Herman, and is staying at Stony Brook for her PhD.
No, for a postdoc.
For a postdoc, sorry, thank you. And when we went to the Antarctic Peninsula with Rachel and a whole group of other penguin researchers, we sampled a whole bunch of different colonies on the Antarctic Peninsula. And when Rachel got back in the lab and did genomic work, she put together a data set that showed that all these colonies, even though they're the idea with Gentoo penguins in this part of the world is that the Falklands are genetically distinct from the birds on South Georgia, which are genetically distinct from the birds on the Antarctic Peninsula. And yet, even within the Antarctic Peninsula, she found she could identify most of the colonies as genetically differentiated, even over fairly short distances. And one of the things we're really excited about doing is getting sampling from across the Falklands to see whether, this area the size of Connecticut could have some of the same types of patterns where populations are actually not sharing as much individuals as you might think in a typical bird population like this. And that may be a way to actually mitigate over evolutionary time the spread of disease in a group of birds like penguins. So if you're not sharing a lot of individuals with your colonies as these viruses like bird flu start spreading across, which one of the things we know is historically they had to have done that in the past. Now, we don't know whether they were less problematic than they are now. That's entirely possible that they're more problematic now. But at the same time, there could be adaptive strategies that have evolved over evolutionary time to keep your gene pool, if you're a Gentoo penguin, from getting bird flu, which would mean not sharing, getting individuals from other populations very often. We just don't know.
But then again, it can also make you vulnerable to a wave of a disease-causing organism that goes across as well. Patterns are complicated.
If you think about the white-crowned sparrow situation we were talking about, there are all kinds of aspects at the genetic and physiological level that people can begin to study. And so, again, the goal of this work is to get blood samples of penguins. We've also got permission to salvage some of the non-penguins because that's something that we can also learn from. So we won't be collecting live birds, but we'll be looking for we'll be getting birds out of some of the freezers that have come in to Stanley, and we'll be hopefully prepping those and getting DNA samples. And again, penguins are one aspect of the bird community down there, but it's an interesting bird community. There's something like 60 or so breeding species on the islands. And then there are many, many vagrants. So I was looking on eBird, and I think it's 191 species recorded from the Falklands. And so lots of weird things show up there. So North American birds like eastern kingbird and American redstart have showed up there. And at the same time, then there are these really fascinating birds to me that we would know really well from North America, like black-crowned night heron, turkey vulture, peregrine falcon, which are literally so broadly distributed that they have breeding populations in the Falklands.
What? That's cool.
Yeah. So, and I just, it's a very isolated part of the world, but it's got a lot of interesting things going on that we're really excited to get the opportunity and the support to go down and work there.
So there have been endemicity has been generated there too. So there are a couple of endemic species, including a bizarre duck that steamers, the flightless duck that is there, which is pretty cool.
And it's only in the Falklands?
So there's an interesting aspect. That's one of the few birds I know of where the issue of flightless is kind of debated in its sense that it may be that flightless steamer duck is not entirely flightless. But there is an isolated population on the Falklands, which gets occasional individuals from Argentina that are flighted that get there. And so that's a really interesting thing that some folks from Cornell have worked on over the years at the genetic level.
So my fun fact of the day that I didn't think about until today when I was looking it up is where the word steamers comes from. And I found that completely fascinating. So it's the swimming behavior where they kind of flap their wings and feet on the water. And it reminded people of the old time steamers. Oh,
they're very cool.
Paddle steamers. And so that's really pretty interesting. I love the use of words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you seen them before, John?
Before I got to the Falklands the first time?
Mm-hmm.
No. And we went to a place called Sea Lion Island, which is the southernmost island that has anybody living on it. And it's a absolutely wonderful place to visit. The couple that runs it, the husband is a very good active e-birder, but the island is basically this 4 kilometer long island that has never had. So one of the historic problems in places like with any kind of islands, but the Falklands is a particularly tough example of this, is rats and mice are very common across all the big islands, and they've decimated a lot of the breeding populations of some of the smaller birds that are resident there, such that the only real populations of them now are actually on smaller islands that haven't had rats and mice, like sea lion. But just walking around this island and just seeing all these birds on their basically tundra breeding grounds, doing what they do is just tremendously fun. And then you get over to the beaches, and there are all these southern elephant seals pulling themselves up out of the water and just going through their molt on the beaches. And it's a different world. And so we had a blast when we had the little time we had, just a few days the last time. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing it more. It's not easy to move around on the island. So there's a airplane service that gets to various parts of the island on a regular basis. And then on the big islands, there's road systems, but again, the population is only about 4,000 people. So you're pretty much out on your own in these areas in terms of trying to get to places, but we're really looking forward to it. It's a very close-knit community. So we're working with a woman named Giselle Hazel, who is actually the wife of the captain of the ship we went to Antarctica with. And they own an island in the western part of the Falklands, and she's been setting up the logistics for it, and so it's going to be a very interesting trip.
And remember, he's going to be there not in our winter, right? So don't feel sorry for him that he's going to be freezing, because the last time he went, it was warmer.
John's going to be at the beach.
Yes, it's true.
So it is absolutely true, and at the same time, because of the currents resulting from of the Drake Passage, even in the summer, you can get really nasty weather systems that basically come through for several days.
But they don't use the word polar vortex to describe what you're going to experience. When they do describe the weather you are leaving me with, in such a way to shovel the snow while you're gone. I have no desire to go to Antarctica. It's too cold. It's too cold. I don't want to go to a place where if you fall in the water, you die, because I feel like if I go into Lake Michigan in the summertime, I'll die because it's too cold. So I'm not going to Antarctica. No.
Wait, so John, where will you stay? And what will you eat? What are the mechanics of all that?
Well, as I said, it's a British territory, and so we'll be, almost all the land is private. And so we've had to secure permission, and Giselle was helping us do a lot of that with local landowners. And so we'll probably be staying in small places associated with those buildings that they have. And it is a place that people can go for tourism and get a lot of different approaches. I mean, I was mentioning Sea Lion. So Sea Lion has this absolutely beautiful sort of bread and breakfast type place that can host as many as probably 30 people at a time. So they've got an airstrip, so people can get there. You basically land at the airstrip and you're at the Airbnb, and then you can just go out into the island to explore from there. But and there are basically Gentoo penguin colonies literally in the front yard of the bed and breakfast.
Cool.
So sometimes you don't. In some of these other places, we're going to be driving quite a ways to get to these colonies that are along shores that are just at the end of a road, and it's good. I think it's going to be an adventure.
Hey, John, what do you know about Cobb's wren, the other endemic?
So one of my favorite Cobb's wren stories is when we were in Sea Lion last time, and I'm still kicking myself for this. We got out to this area where there were probably 5 or 6 southern elephant seals pulled up on the shore, and there were flies all over the place. And insect diversity in the Falklands is not high. There can't be more than a handful of insect species. But the Cobb's wrens were actually foraging all over these elephant seals, along with a bunch of austral thrushes, which is another semi-endemic bird to the Falklands. And so it's this relative of house wren that's been out on the Falklands for long enough that it looks very different morphologically. And it's another one of these birds that has moved mostly, is now restricted mostly to the smaller islands that don't have rats and mice. And so, but it was a neat little bird. And I took a bunch of great pictures of them and realized I had a camera setting wrong on my camera. And
Oh no.
Of course. Yeah.
the pictures all sucked. And
Oh.
so I'm hoping we get to see some more.
Nice. We've all been there. Oh, man.
John, I was wondering, how do you manage like going there for work and studying and also being a birder? Like, are there things that you want to do when you're not studying that it's like, all right, now I have time off, I can go look for this? Or is it kind of all encompassing and you're always kind of looking at everything?
That's a really great question, because what I would say is, and again, we worked in Africa and South America. My mentality is always to try to learn as much about the birds, all the birds as possible, no matter what we're doing. So we were talking about Elena Tuttle and the work she did on white-throated sparrows. That's not the way I've generally approached the places I've gone, in the sense that in a lot of the early work I did, we were trying to do surveys of places. So the penguin work, I always have to remind myself, and we're there to make sure we get the penguin samples. So you've got to focus on that. And when you're doing that, you're definitely not looking at anything else. But there'll be opportunities to look at other things. And this is something that I'm excited about, just because we saw the same thing in Sea Lion Island when we went there. We were in Sea Lion Island at the end of January. And as Shannon was saying, that's actually the end of the breeding season, the end of as summer sort of, and so young were out of the nest, but we would still find active nests of birds out on these, because it's basically tundra. And so if you're observant, you can see lots of different things about the biology of these birds pretty easily, just because you're not dealing with tall trees and things like that. So it'll be possible. And then one of the things we really benefit from in a digital age is recording those data would historically have been through field notes. And I'd like to say that I think myself as someone who takes field notes, and I am, but I'm nowhere near as good as I need to be with respect to having those data get recorded over time. But in the last trip, we were doing eBird lists every single day on the Falklands, and we'll be doing the same thing this time too. And that's data that, provides an independent set of information about what's going on, in addition to the material that we get.
Nice.
Do you guys want to go to there? Do you want to go to Antarctica?
Yeah, I would do it.
Well, let me emphasize. I was
Yeah.
going to say the differences between the three places that we went on this 22 trip by sailboat. We went to the Antarctic Peninsula, which is, it's another world. It's warming very fast along the peninsula, just like the main part of the continent is. But there's still glaciers that are 40 meters thick coming right down to the edge of the water there. There are no plants to speak of until you get to the outermost islands, and then there's one species of grass. And then you go north to South Georgia, and you're still south of the polar front, but there's this narrow band of tussock grass around the base of South Georgia. It has literally one passerine bird. It's a bird called South Georgia pipit. And then it's got penguins and wandering albatrosses or snowy albatrosses and things like that breeding there. So lots of seabirds breed there. And then you go to the Falklands, and suddenly now you've got this area without any glaciers at all. So it certainly gets snow in the winter. But it's got a number of small passerine birds that have gotten there from South America for the most part. It's even, Stanley even has house sparrows, for instance, which is Stanley's the capital. So all those areas are different. And I guess that's one of the things I've always liked about birding in general is, if you go from the southern U.S. to the northern U.S., you're going to see different groups of birds. And I guess when I mapped it out, one of the things I've said about those three areas is distance-wise, it's basically along the lines of a triangle between Illinois, New Orleans, and Denver in terms of how far apart those areas are.
Oh, wow.
And if you think about how much the bird communities change from Denver to Chicago, it's quite a bit.
Right.
And even though diversity isn't as high, it's still there. And so, yeah, it's going to be really fun to get to know some of these Falkland birds a little better, and get them to know and do it in the breeding season when they'll be raising young, which is something that I really enjoy anytime you get an opportunity to see stuff like that.
I want to go back to because I think you guys take for granted how cool it is what you do. But to go for people like RJ and I who would never do an adventure like this for work, and to us it is an adventure. To you, I know it's work too. But I want to know, are you going to be camping at all, or because it is summer, or is it all private houses, or are you going to be at the Airbnb? How does it work?
Yeah, it looks like we will not be camping very much, although we'll see what happens. And so that's kind of a nice thing, because getting gear back and forth to places like the Falklands can be really problematic. So that's kind of a good thing in some ways. But at the same time, I think it'll be pretty rustic. I think the food will be, it'll be simple camp food, and that's for us oftentimes spaghetti and rice and beans and things like that. But it's all, that I never go anywhere like that for the food. So
it's a good thing, because some of the places you go don't have much food, actually. Some of the places in Africa in particular, they really don't.
But I would come back and say that on those trips, in this 2022 trip, I absolutely was pinching myself all the time about the places we were standing on and what we were looking at. It's just crazy, because I never thought I would ever get to any of those areas. And I guess, I'd emphasize that while they're not easy to get to, they're not impossible to get to either. And certainly the Falklands is an example of that. People can go. And I wouldn't say you could go there super cheaply, but it's not super expensive either.
I think of that, though, Amanda. John's family traveled a lot when he was growing up, so this is kind of in his DNA and in his blood. But I never went anywhere when I was growing up, and we camped because we didn't have enough money to stay in hotels, and we didn't fly anywhere because we didn't have enough money to do those kinds of things. And so we were very local. I spent a lot of time outside, but not outside in Antarctica. So when I went to Costa Rica, well, even going to Louisiana, when I said I was going to go there, my dad looked at the map. He's like, "You're going there? You're going where?" And I got in an unair-conditioned car and I drove across the country by myself to go to graduate school, a complete and utter farce, actually, at some level. I don't know why I thought I could do what I did. I had no business thinking I could do anything that I did. So when you're young, you take a chance on yourself. It's why I love spending time with young people, because they remind me of that, the kind of the good aspect of risk-taking behavior when your brain's not fully formed. So, you're 20 years old, you get in a car and you drive across the country by yourself. And my parents were really supportive. They never told me no. Plenty of the rest of the world told me girls don't do that, but my parents never told me that. So I'm like, okay, well, if this doesn't work, I'm sure I can figure out something else to do too. But and then the first time I got in a plane and went to Costa Rica, I couldn't believe it. There, pinching myself, right? That this person who'd barely ever been in a plane was all of a sudden in a jungle in Costa Rica with houseplants that are 30 meters tall, and my best friends and my future husband.
That's amazing.
But circling back to your question, RJ, earlier, which is the focus will be on getting the work done. And we've got a really interesting schedule in the sense we'll be moving around quite a bit. And so that's going to probably complicate the amount of time that that there is for sort of just looking randomly for birds. And yet at the same time, we'll definitely keep our eyes open.
If you spend enough time with us, and you guys probably get a sense of that with this podcast, we don't have divisions in our life. We don't compartmentalize at all, kind of. Maybe a little bit with respect to our son's sports, but he would always tell us when he was little, he goes, when do you turn into mommy and daddy again? In other words, stop talking about birds. But I don't know. I kind of can't imagine it being any other way.
Well, and I think one of the things that I love about this podcast is getting to talk to you guys about sort of how we think about some of this stuff. And it is about the science. And at the same time, it's about the science in a place that has people living in it that are basically stewards of the biodiversity that's there. And so, you get to interact with them. And it's always amazing to see the kinds of things that are being done in these different countries to protect biodiversity. And so that's another aspect of it that I think I didn't appreciate when I was younger, but I appreciate a lot more now.
Yeah, well, we're super jealous of both of you. I mean, we feel like you guys are amazing people and are so fortunate. And I know you both worked so hard to get where you are, but you're also so lucky to be able to do all of these different things. Amanda and I get to live vicariously through you.
Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah.
I think we're super weird and boring. Well, John's
No
not,
way.
but I think I am.
Well,
You're
weird.
not
No.
either, Shannon.
No.
No way.
I have also often said that I get paid to do my avocation.
That's pretty awesome.
And I kind of realized that when I was a pre-med at the University of Arizona and took cell biology and was, I think, I might have been getting a C in the course because I just realized I just didn't care as much about it as most of the pre-meds did. And suddenly it was like the light went on and it was, wow, somebody might pay me to study birds the rest of my life.
Wow.
Oh, I didn't know people got paid to study birds when I didn't know anything about birds when I was growing up, really. And I took a class on the natural history of vertebrates of British Columbia, and we went bird watching, and that's how I got introduced to birds. And I got introduced to a whole new set of people who I'd never met anybody like this, who actually walked around in nature and counted birds and got paid. I didn't know that was a thing growing up. And all of a sudden that transformed the way I thought about I was going to be a medical doctor too. And it's only because I had a mentor in this job I got through taking that course, that he told me what graduate school was. And, a couple months later, I was in an unair conditioned car driving to Louisiana by myself. The only qualifications I had is that I took tests well and I had good grades.
And you like birds.
At that point, yeah, but certainly that was a new thing for me. That was a new thing for me too. So you just never know. You have to pay attention to subtle signals in your life that tell you that there are other paths you can go on. I always tell people you can't be something you don't know. And I didn't know I existed when I was growing up. I didn't know my career existed. I didn't know people had PhDs. I had no clue about any of that. And to me, that's one of the things that has been really important about this podcast, is if some little girl listens, she can be something else too.
That's right.
Thanks everyone for joining us this week. We appreciate all of you for listening. Check out our socials on Blue Sky, Instagram, and TikTok. If you're enjoying our podcast, please leave us a review in your podcast app and also tell your friends about us. We're still trying to grow, and that goes a long way. If you have a question for us, you can reach us at podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com. Okay, love you all. See you all next week.